Welcome to Westmont's Compelling Conversations. I'm Gayle D. Beebe, president of Westmont College. In Compelling Conversations, I engage scholars, leaders, authors, and members of our community in discussions that inform us about essential issues and encourage us to take meaningful action. Today, it's my privilege to welcome Dr. Marcus Goodie Goodloe to Compelling Conversations. And we're going to hear from Goodie about a life story that's just amazing, both in terms of its challenge and all that he's done to make a great contribution with his life. Goodie, welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Goodie, why don't you start by telling us where you were born and raised? I think it's just amazing to get a context for your life.
Well, it's a long way from Montecito, let me tell you that. No, I grew up in South Central LA, a place called Compton, and a place that's over the years has been known to be a place ravaged by heartache and heartbreak and difficulty and challenge. It's the inner city of LA. In fact, I often tell people the nickname for Compton is actually the hub city. It's in the center of all of LA. And so right there, in the center of LA County is this small town, little town, 100,000 plus people. I grew up in South Central LA in Compton, California. Those are my roots. I tell people I never watched a movie straight out of Compton, but I lived it. Yeah. I lived it, yeah. Grew up there.
Well, community of faith mattered a great deal to you, and one of the things that's just so unique about your background is how much the faith community really shaped you.
Yeah, I know you and I are both former athletes, and we have to break out our VHS tapes one day, show highlight reels. But I often tell people, equate my upbringing to that of sports team, or even maybe being that I'm in LA to that of a production, a performance. We're all where we are, in part because of a supporting cast, right? Same thing with teammates, right? No one wins a championship alone. Even in individual sports, you have a team. And so I was very fortunate to have spotters. We get up under a bench press and we try to lift the weight, and often say, don't attempt to lift weights without spotters. And so the weight for me was growing up without a father and growing up in the inner city, housing projects, single parent mother. But the faith community, my mother raising us up in the context of a local church, my mother who is still with us, she's been a follower of Jesus since she was 14. And for us, church was a way of life. It was never an option for us not to go. In fact, my nickname before it was Goodie, when I was little, my nickname was Rev. Rev, as in short for Reverend, because my friends would make fun of me because we were in church all day, 4 or 5 days a week, twice on Sundays. And so they would be like, Rev, where are you going now? But no, my mother and that faith community locally there and a couple other folks along the way kind of helped sort of guide and come alongside me to advance me forward.
Well, you found enormous joy and success as an athlete. Talk a little about just your draw into athletics and then the way it kind of opened up a whole new array of contacts and people and really a completely new support system as you went forward in life.
Yeah, so, I chose University of New Mexico, great opportunity to play there. There were some coaches who had observed me when I was in the LA area who later became on the coaching staff of UNM. Among them is Marvin Lewis, who went on to become coach for the Bengals, who now coaches for the Raiders, assistant coach. A guy named Mike Shepard. They both were at Long Beach State. They had watched me as a high schooler, and lo and behold, they go to UNM. I don't know this, but they actually recruit me. I choose UNM. I get to UNM, and they sold me on there are over 300 plus days of sunshine. It's just like LA. What they did not tell me is in LA, I could wear V-neck t-shirts. In Albuquerque, it's a little different, but the temperatures, in light of the temperatures. But get there, we didn't win a lot of many games, but man, I won so much more. I get there, and New Mexico for me, Albuquerque in particular, is a place that I've always identified as sort of that turning point. I faced a lot of crucible moments that shaped my life. Shameless plug for your work there. And one of them was just trying to make sense of my life, right? So December 11th, 1990, accepted my call into ministry. I had given my life to the Lord when I was young at 12 years old, but formally accepted my call into ministry. At that time, I had been attending a local church, a First Baptist Church of Albuquerque with a family, the Stewarts, and along with another individual named Harvey Collier. And the Stewarts became that surrogate family for me, modeled of something that I had never seen before. Again, because I alluded to the fact that I grew up in a single-parent family home, but knew I had the gift of leadership. Romans 12:8, knew that early on in my life. And then it was a matter of, like Uncle Ben tells young Peter, with great powers comes great responsibilities. And so I knew I had these gifts, the gift of leadership and the ability to speak and those type of things. And then it was like, what is it that God was calling me to do and become with that? And then talking to Chet Stewart, my dad, my surrogate dad, this thing called seminary. And I said, what, cemetery? I don't want to, And turns out my dad talked about seminary, a place where you can go and formally study the scriptures. The one difference with this seminary that I chose, Golden Gate Seminary, now called Gateway, a guy named Bill Cruz was the president, God rest his soul, great man. I remember sitting down with him at a local restaurant in Albuquerque. He had come to Albuquerque to do some business. My dad said, hey, I think he's somebody you would want to talk to and meet. And sitting right across from me, within moments, Cruz, Bill Cruz, Dr. Cruz, said, I recognize some gifts in you. Among them is leadership. And he said, you need to know something about our institution. We're in the business of shaping leaders. I had never heard that. I had heard seminaries about preaching, evangelism, mission, but a seminary that's shaping leaders. Now remember, this is the early 90s. Now leadership is vogue, right? Everyone's talking about leadership, There's even a conference, I think, called Lead Where You Stand, right? But no, leadership back in the 90s. And so I chose Golden Gate Seminary, and little did I know, another link to that major decision was eventually finding the woman who I'm now married to 26 years later, because she was in the Bay Area, and we found each other at a local church that she was already serving in. So Albuquerque was that sort of critical turning point for me for a whole host of reasons. Accepting my call in the ministry, coming into a relationship with a family, and specifically a father and mother figure for that matter, and then transitioning over to graduate school where I eventually would meet my wife. Yeah.
Well, thinking of graduate school, you have become a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar. What was your initial opening interest? How did you develop that, and then how has that unfolded?
Like you, we share a similar passion and love. I had always known Dr. King of his life and of his commitment for nonviolence to advance the cause of justice, peace, and equality. Even as a young kid growing up in the inner city, I was always looking for a methodology and a way to try to advance the things that I thought that we needed to be about as a nation. And so I was involved, even as a young kid, politically. I was actively involved. I was doing voter registration. I'd served on a couple of local campaigns. But I remember as a 12, 13-year-old kid, roughly, and wanting to learn more about Dr. King. Back then, there was a magazine called Right On Magazine, I think it was. But anyway, you could order copies of Dr. King's speeches through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They had a little promo advertisement in this magazine. You open it up and you would fill out a form and you could check a box in terms of the speeches you wanted. Imagine that. And I didn't have a checkbook at the time. I remember going to a local, mini mart or liquor store. I would get a money order and I would get mail that in for the cost of shipping and handling, and I would get these tapes back, these little white cassettes. Now, for those of you who are listening to this, a cassette tape is, but anyway, and I would get these cassette tapes. Sony Walkman, I had a little borrowed Sony Walkman. I click play, and I would listen to a man named King who had died, some years before I was born. I was born in 71. He was killed April 4th, 1968. But in that span of about 2-3 years, it was almost as if I knew him as I'm sitting here with you. He spoke to me. I believe Dr. King was, in the words of Tavis Smiley, I believe he's the greatest American we've ever produced. And I believe he's a person who was called by God for such a time that he lived. And he is, in my opinion, the most consequential figure of the 20th century.
Oh, that's powerful. Well, go further in terms of what types of themes you've pursued in your own scholarship, and then you've just been a huge help to me in terms of really mentoring me in King scholarship, including introducing me to Claiborne Carson.
Yeah, we'll start there. Claiborne Carson, I consider him the Michael Jordan of scholarship. He attended UNM for 2 years, ended up coming out to LA to visit his sister, came across UCLA and said, I'm never going back. actually attends UCLA, comes on faculty, as you know there, actually attended the March on Washington.
That's right.
Imagine that, and then find himself years later in a conversation with Miss Coretta Scott King. But my journey to become a King Scholar began, again, all those years when I was listening to those speeches, but carrying that forward when I was a part of graduate school and eventually a faith community, serving and leading. Was a number of those communities of faith, we would have people of influence to come to our congregation. There's a famous line on a rapper named Biggie Smalls, and he says, "More money, more problems." In other words, people's money, the amount of money you have, does not assuage challenges you have, right? It's not. And so we would have our congregation consist of people who were famous. These people were on television shows, they were in reality shows, they were sports figures, and they would come to us, Gayle, with these heartbreaking challenges in their marriages, in their personal lives, in their parenting, issues of substance abuse, being conflicted about taking on roles within acting. Hey, I'm trying to make it in this entertainment world, but my personal convictions, I'm having to read for a role, and it's having me portray a character. Anyway, so I was a part of a community of faith, several, where we as women and men of the gospel were trying to come alongside them, shepherd them, pastor them, lead them. At the same time, there were opportunities for us as a community to engage these people on issues that were within our community that were happening. Issues related to policies or laws, things that we felt as a community of faith we should be leaning into. And then the more and more we began to have those conversations, I realized there was a person who was of the cloth, a clergy figure, who was really the first pastor to celebrities. I don't want to say celebrity pastor. Right. He was really the first pastor to celebrities, long before some of the women and men you and I both know. And he gained their trust. He knew of their craft. They knew of his commitment and his passion. And so your Harry Belafontes, your Nina Simone's, your Eartha Kitts, your Marlon Brando's, your Sammy Davis Jr.'s, your Aretha Franklin's, Jackie Robinson's of the world. And Dr. King was really the first to come alongside them, to minister to them, but also speak into their lives and saying these words. Could it be that you're called for something even greater than just hitting a ball, running fast, jumping high? And he invited them into a cause greater than themselves, what he called a coalition of conscience. Dr. King believed that there were people of goodwill, people of affluence and influence, common people, people from all walks of life, who had a sort of a distaste for what they were seeing on their television screens that were being portrayed and acted out against people of color in our country. And in the words of Dr. King, he said, listen, I want America to just be true to what we say on paper. Yeah. And so Dr. King recruited those athletes and entertainers. And for me, he was that life metaphor in real time for me to know that, wow, there are people who are part of our society who can help advance causes that I believe in. I'll say it like this. We're all equal in essence, but we're not all equal in influence. There's a difference.
It's a beautiful statement.
There's a difference. One is given by God, right? Our essence. We are all made in the imago Dei, all made in the image of God. But let's face it, there are some people who will call, you will pick up right now. If David Brooks called right now, you would answer the phone. You would just pause right now and say, Goody, hold up, David's calling. I know that. But no, seriously, it's because we recognize unique gifts and talents and space and creativity that God has given some of us, not to everyone, to whether that's to make money, whether it's to have a voice on a more broader platform. And so for me, Dr. King was that in terms of leading people of influence and affluence in terms of the civil rights movement. Their resources, their presence mattered, like literally raising money for the cause. That money would go for bail, for hotel, for flights, accommodations, for literature, getting the word out about what we're trying to put pressure on members of our government to help advance issues of justice and fairness.
That's a beautiful, beautiful commentary. When you look at King, a conversation that you and I have had off the record has been about people trying to redo what he was about, what his core teachings were about, and you've been helpful to me in terms of just sorting that out. What are your thoughts, kind of your wider perspective on the core of King's message and its enduring value?
Well, you know, we have had a chance to connect, and I know you alluded to Dr. Claiborne Carson, as others, you know, Taylor Branch and David Garrow, Stephen B. Oates. These are incredible scholars who have had access to not only King's writings, but in recent years, we now have had access to some of the private tapes that have existed, that have recorded King when he practically was even unaware. We now know in King's most intimate settings that he was true to on matters as related to nonviolence, as related to his views on issues and related to our government. He was loyal to a fault at times, even when members of our government were trying to mischaracterize people who he associated with. Dr. King remained true to the ethics and the practices of nonviolence. He was one who believed that as a nation, we could do better than what we were doing, and that he was really committed to this cause of civil rights. He was not someone who was chasing after the mighty dollar. He could have gone a different path in terms of his scholarship and done some other things, but we now know that even in his most intimate conversations that he really believed in the way of love and the way of peace and the way of nonviolence. And he found himself literally at a crossroads in our nation when he looked out and saw some of the disparity that exists in some people who call for violence, some people who call for a more aggressive approach to engaging the government. Engaging the government for Dr. King meant having a plan, and that plan consisted oftentimes of marching nonviolently, direct action, boycotting, but never taking up arms. In fact, he goes back to Memphis. He goes back to Memphis in part because he had been there just a week and a half too earlier, where a march he led on behalf of sanitation workers had erupted into some violence. So he goes back and says, hey, no, we're standing with the sanitation workers, and we're trying to advance their issues related to equal pay, better pay, issues of favorable working conditions that they were in. So he goes back to Memphis in part to say, I can't be a part of anything that turns into violence or disruption, you know. And so he goes back, and of course, you know, he met his maker on April 4th, 1968. But anyway, so I think for me, when I hear people make the criticism of Dr. King, I just would say, let's make sure if we're going to hold King to that standard, we need to do that to all of these, quote, great women and men that we oftentimes esteem, from the founding fathers on down through the generations, you know. No, King was not a perfect person, but I believe he was called to a perfect mission, and that mission was to redeem the soul of America.
Claiborne Carson has really done some important work at Stanford with the King Papers, and you're networked widely in the King scholarship community. Who is doing important work that we need to really pay attention to, and not just for their fidelity to King, but the fidelity to King's wider impact as a messenger?
Well, I mean, shameless plug here. I think we're doing that. I think part of the conference we have with Lead Where You Stand, I think there are organizations like Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of course, NAACP, the Urban League. Yeah. There are still these institutions that I think that are in the fight, that are in partnership with other nonprofit and faith entities, organizations. I think the local church, I think it's grossly underappreciated, underestimated, the power of the local church. When Dr. King spoke, his first meeting to advance the Montgomery bus boycott, his first press conference was not at the Hilton. It was at a Baptist church, in which he's literally arriving and find himself, outside. There's thousands of people gathered because they hear about this woman named Rosa Parks who refused to give up her seat on the bus. And so the local church has a role to play. I think we just recently had Dr. Richard Hoss here, as you know, and one of the entities, I think one of the very few entities he specifically listed that has to be vocal, has to speak out, has to offer a clarion call in the midst of what we're facing. He said preachers, and I think he may have said the faith community. He definitely said pastors, preachers. I remember him saying Absolutely. That. And so I think the local church has a role to play. We cannot be silent. We cannot be indifferent. Have a mentor who's still with us, J. Alfred Smith Sr. He used to pastor a church called Allen Temple Baptist Church in the Bay Area, is where I met my wife Lucy. But he would say, we can't be so concerned about the sweet by and by while ignoring the dusty here and down and out and the downtrodden that exist here. And we dare not have a religion that's focused on the hereafter while ignoring the plight and the conditions of our people. And so policies and rights and voting and things like that, we have to engage. And I think the local church has a role to play in helping to be a voice in our times that we're living in.
Goodie, you've been a prolific author. You've written books. Just walk us through the ideas behind the books and what you have hoped would be their impact.
Oh, thank you so much for that. You know, the first book I wrote really is expression of my dissertation. It's called Kingmaker. And when I finished my dissertation, you think you can identify with this, you're like, está terminado, it is finished, never again. And then I had a professor named Hak Jun Lee. Hak Jun Lee. Hak Jun Lee is at Fuller.
Oh my.
And he is still at Fuller today. And I remember meeting with him. He called me up. He too is a King scholar. He studied some aspects about preaching, King's preaching and theology. Incredible mind. Korean brother, and we broke bread at a California Pizza Kitchen in Pasadena. He had me to guest lecture for his class. Right. This wasn't even a year after I graduated from my PhD at Dallas Baptist. And he looked across the table from me and he said, my brother, I have not heard the things you have discussed here with me in regards to your dissertation. He says, you must write a book. And he said, you need to promise me. And I'm looking at this guy. And I'm like, wait, you're not even buying lunch today. And now you're asking me to write a book. Wait, what? Anyway, I get in my car, and as you know, that drive back from Pasadena to Southern, that's a long drive. And I'm thinking, I got to write a book. Because a book continues the conversation. There's not too many dissertations being read off shelves or in the programs you can find online. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to write it, can I write it in a way that's practically helpful? So there's a couple books that are out there, Jesus CEO, Leadership Lessons of Jesus, that kind of gave me an idea of how I wanted to write it. And so that's Kingmaker. And it basically talks about athletes and entertainers and King's work with them to advance the civil rights movement. The second book is called Habits. Wow, what a journey that book has been. I have had the privilege of hanging out with incredible women and men in leadership from various facets and expressions, from law enforcement, military, university presidents, head coaches, athletic department directors, just across a number of different spheres. And I would come up with these different sort of expressions from them, insights they would give about what has brought them to these moments of great leadership, roles and responsibilities. But then as I peeled back the layers, I discovered that there was these common themes that they all have. Whether it's an owner of a Chick-fil-A, or university president, or the leader of the largest sheriff's department in America, all of them have these leadership traits or expressions, and they're basically what I call habits, and these habits that they all have. And wouldn't you know it, all 6 of these habits are found in the life of Jesus. It's have fun, assume the best in others, be good soil, insist upon excellence, and treat the needs of others as sacred, and seek community. All of these leaders do all of those things well. And so that's habits. Final book is a book on devotion I wrote recently. It's called The Next Level. When I was serving at a church in Dallas, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, there was a well-known preacher there. You may know him. His name is Tony Evans, one of the greatest expositors. And when I get to Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, I'm interviewing for this role. Just didn't seek it. It came. God's grace brought my wife and I to this amazing church in Dallas. And he said, if you were to come here, how would you lead the ministry? And I get to this interview and I take a look at this youth ministry at the time. And this is not a disrespect to anyone who was serving there, but I walked in and I said, this is not what we can be. There's another level. And that's the name I gave the youth ministry over 25 years ago. And I then, sort of put that into focus. Luke chapter 2, verse 52, when it says, Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and others. What does it look like for young people to grow, to get to the next level? It's in that verse. And so the next level speaks about your devotion to God and not settling for anything in terms of where you are, in your faith, in your worship, in your giving, in your serving. There's another level. There's another level I can get to. I want to lean. I want to grow in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and others. So those are the 3 books. It's been a joy. And I tell people, for me, I enjoy speaking. And books allow for, you're vulnerable. Books allow for people to continue a conversation with you even after you're off the stage. Absolutely. And so that's the beauty of a book.
Well, when you look at, nothing gets done in life without personal discipline, and certainly being an athlete, you had to be super disciplined. Being an author and a speaker requires a different type of discipline, but still a disciplined life. Would you be willing to talk a little about just the personal disciplines that really pattern your life?
Yeah, so one, I think for me, I told a young person this the other day. In fact, it may have been a young person here that had reached out to me through your executive assistant wrote a note to me. Addie was so kind to pass along. I told this individual, never speak about something that you're not living.
That's good advice.
That's kind of important. In the streets, we call it keeping it 100. Keeping it 100. I think there needs to be consistency in what you speak about, and I haven't always done that. I mean, by God's grace, I am what I am today. So 1, 2, make sure that your anchor is beyond something that you can see. It is faith of the things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. And so for me, that's my relationship with Jesus. I try to lean into Him and day in and day out, hour in and hour out, minute in and minute. I'm actively involved. I run. I try to connect to Him in my runs. So I would say, live what you're talking about. Obviously, be connected and anchored in something. Have someone that can get a prayer through on your behalf. And if you're fortunate to meet someone that God has called you to spend the rest of your life with, a spouse, make sure that they have a relationship with God. There will come times when your faith will not be enough. When you need that spotter, you'll need someone who is there as the parakaleo is for us, the Holy Spirit. But you'll need someone physically who is there with you by your side to call you on your stuff, right? But also to say, you know what, let's pray. Let's lean into this moment. Let's believe God for more. I think we all need that. We all need that. And so for me, that's important. The other thing I would say is make sure you surround yourself with, Dave Chappelle calls it a coalition of the willing. Who is your coalition of the willing? I think it matters who you surround yourself with, right? There's a great African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go with others. Who is your other? We all have to have others. And so for me, I've benefited from having others. I alluded to the fact that I grew up in LA, and as you know, LA is known for, in part, Tinseltown, entertainment, Hollywood. Yeah. The Oscars are going to happen in just a few weeks' time, us recording this podcast. Regardless of who wins, I guarantee what will happen when they take the stage. Best supporting actor, lead actor in a major motion picture. They will thank their agent. They will thank their parents. It amazes me, all these stars, they all stumble. They have no words when they get up. They are lost. But they will say, I want to thank my amazing cast, supporting cast. They'll say that. I could not have done this work without my cast. That's true. And so for me, I want to thank my cast. It's my mother, Mary Wagner. It's my little league coach. It's Deputy Rita Hayes. It's J. Alfred Smith. It's Tony Evans. It's Erwin McManus. It's Chester French Stewart, Diana Stewart. That's my supporting cast. Eugenia Franklin, my godmother. People who have been there for me, who have been those anchors in my life. It's Gayle Beebe. I appreciate our relationship and how it's evolved for the last 4.5 years. And so I'm really grateful for that. And, the last thing I'll say on that point is I think, I tell people, this life is not a practice run. We'll get one time to do this. And like the Apostle Paul tells Timothy, I want my life to be poured out as a libation offering to make a difference for the Lord, for the kingdom of God. And I'm hoping that God gives me grace, we'll continue to do that.
Goodie, God has given you favor, and both with your writing and with your speaking, you really have a sense of the pulse of the national conversation. Where do you think we are as a country in terms of faith, and what can we do to actually stimulate a greater outpouring of the Spirit of God?
I do agree with some things that have been shared recently, like Dr. Hall, of course, even Claiborne Carson in our time. I think even David Brooks. I think we are at an inflection point.
Yeah.
I think we are not only a part of history, I think we're witnessing history in real time. The days in which we are living now will be the days for which people will talk about for a century to come. Okay. Coming out of a global pandemic, seeing some of the divides and divisions from our pulpit to our communities, some of the vitriol that exists in our politics, this sense of in vast wealth, in vast advancement in technology and resources, but yet we have a poverty of the human spirit. I think there is a gap that exists in terms of what we say versus who we are. Yeah. And I am convinced, though, that as people of faith, we have to not shrink back. We have to lean into this moment. Leaning into this moment, a couple things. First, I think we need to make sure that we're connected to God in deep, meaningful ways. I always tell leaders, you can't take people to a place that you're not. So what that means for leaders, let's make sure we're locked in with the one who created us and loved us and called us by name. Psalm 139, who created us. Two, I think we have to find things that we can agree upon. We ought to seek common ground. In other words, we should not start our engagement with what we disagree. We should find a ground for which we agree upon, and let's work from there. Yeah. The third thing I would say is that we have to do some confession, and I think part of that confession looks like is, I have not always believed the best about you, and in turn you would say, well, I have not always believed the best about you. And so I think there's something powerful when we take ownership of wrongs, whether that's prejudice, perceptions, in terms of what we've taken, what we've abused, power issues, whatever that is. I think there's power in confession, right? Being reconciled is part of that, being reconciled. I think it's owning up. And then the final thing I would say is, David Brooks has that line in his book, The Road to Character. He talks about these resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And I keep coming back to that. I think we have to be mindful of legacy. What decisions am I making today that when all is said and done, they will not matter? Yeah. Versus, what decisions am I making today that when all is said and done, they will be the only things that matter? Yeah. People won't care where I went to school. They won't remember that. They won't remember that touchdown I threw against the University of Utah in the fourth quarter. They won't remember that. They will not remember the kind of car I drove. They will remember whether I was kind, generous, compassionate, long-suffering. Was I willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt? Did I own my stuff? Did I own up on my stuff? So I challenge leaders to remember those things in the times in which we're living in, particularly this issue of legacy. Let's live not just for right now. Let's be mindful of what is to come. Let's make decisions. The best metaphor I often use, you've heard me use this before, is the ripple effect. Yeah. When I was young, growing up in the inner city, there was a man-made lake next to my housing project. And at this lake, you could fish, but sometimes the fish weren't biting. And I could throw a rock, and would skip rocks rather, in my boredom. And I would skip these rocks across the lake. And sometimes I could get 3 or 4 skips on the rocks, alone on the water with the rocks. But sometimes those rocks wouldn't skip at all. They would land right there. Bloof! But that wasn't the end of it. That rock that landed right there would have ripple effects. Yeah. As leaders, that's how our decisions are, oftentimes, impacting others, if not for this moment, but for times to come.
Goodie, it's been wonderful to be with you. It's wonderful to have a conversation today. Dr. Marcus Goodie Goodloe joining us for a compelling conversation. Thank you.
Join us next time for another compelling conversation with President Gayle D. Beebe.